Our real story begins in 1966 with the Karnar family. Mr. Karnar, a poor man, lived with his wife in one of London's neighborhoods. He worked as a day laborer to support his wife and their 3 children, John, Julia, and Jessica. One day, Mr. Karnar returned home with a suitcase full of money and gold, opening it in front of his disbelieving wife, Mrs. Karnar. She was overjoyed and didn't bother to ask more. Within a month, Mr. Karnar and his family's life completely transformed. They moved into a large house of their own, and John and his siblings attended the best schools. Mrs. Karnar gave birth to their last daughter, Layla, who was the only one among her siblings to live in luxury and comfort from the day she was born. From worrying daily about food and drink, the Karnars lived in constant joy, yet Mr. Karnar was not wasteful. He tried to invest his money wisely and catered to his family's needs without depriving them of anything. Life went on as usual except for one thing, Mr. Karnar's office room, which he didn't allow anyone to enter, not even his wife, in his absence. This room's mystery made Mr. Karnar's 4 children eager to discover what made it off limits. Days passed until Mr. Karnar went on a business trip, prompting Mrs. Karnar to clean the long-closed room quickly. She asked her eldest daughter, Julia, to help her and her siblings. Finally, the chance came for the 4 children to enter their father's room, but as soon as they stepped in, they were hit by a strange smell, as if something was rotting. They quickly opened the window, surprised to find the room spotlessly clean, without a speck of dust, and a bed with white sheets that seemed freshly changed. The children were puzzled and began to inspect every corner of the office. The youngest, Layla, decided to lie on her father's bed, but suddenly heard the sound of someone crying as if she had stepped on someone invisible. Layla jumped up, screaming, and suddenly the window slammed shut. The children, scared by Layla's scream and the window slamming, quickly left the room. Their mother ran to them to find out what happened. After they told her, she laughed it off, advising them not to enter the room again if they were scared. Upon entering and finding the room clean, she decided to leave it as it was and closed the door again. An hour later, Layla began to feel extremely unwell, eventually losing consciousness. Mrs. Karnar was worried about her daughter and quickly fetched a doctor, who discovered that Layla had a severe fever. Mrs. Karnar stayed by her daughter's side day after day, with Layla's condition remaining unchanged until Mr. Karnar returned from his trip and learned of his daughter's illness. The first thing he asked was whether anyone had entered the room. John confessed that they had entered it to clean. Mr. Karnar scolded his children, warning them never to enter the room again, and he quickly went inside and locked himself in. John, being the eldest, was curious and tried to eavesdrop, but strangely he heard nothing. Suddenly, he smelled the same strong, rotting odor as before, making it difficult to breathe, so he quickly moved away from the room and waited for his father to come out. An hour later, Mr. Karnar emerged looking tense and scared, while Layla, completely recovered, stood happily in front of the door, having forgotten the bizarre incident. However, the mystery of the forbidden room, especially for Layla, who now feared entering it, lingered in the minds of all Mr. Karnar's children. Months and years passed until one day the family received the shocking news of Mr. Karnar's sudden death at his workplace. The family, especially Mrs. Karnar, who had not even enjoyed 10 years out of poverty, was devastated. She found herself alone with 4 children, bereft of the life she and her husband had dreamt of together before he died at the age of 35. His office remained closed, a reminder of their late father that no one wanted to enter. Years passed, and Mr. Karnar's children grew up and started their own families. John, after marrying a beautiful woman named Sarah, stayed in the same house with his mother and decided to turn his father's office into an extra bedroom in anticipation of children. After a long wait for offspring, Sarah started to despair of not being able to conceive, plunging into depression and longing for just one child. Eventually, Sarah emerged from her depression but changed entirely into a constantly tense and irritable person. Their disagreements grew until John decided to work abroad, visiting his wife every few months, which worsened Sarah's condition to the point that she lashed out at Mrs. Karnar. One day, Layla came to visit her mother. Suddenly, Layla heard her brother's wife threatening her mother that she would hit her if she spoke. Shocked, Layla went to talk to her mother to understand what was happening. Her mother pleaded with her not to tell her brother to avoid escalating their conflicts. Layla, saddened, promised her mother she would visit every day. After some time, during one of John's visits home, he entered to an unusual silence. He called for his mother and wife, but no one responded. Suddenly, he heard laughter coming from his father's old office. Approaching quietly, he suspected his wife was with another man. In a moment of rage, John grabbed a knife from the kitchen, entered the room, and found his wife sitting next to a strange man, both with their backs to him. In shock, John swiftly attacked his wife with the knife. Mrs. Karnar came running at the noise, finding her son with a bloodied knife and his wife dead before him. Collapsing, Mrs. Karnar asked what he had done, but John was in a daze. There was no one else in the room. The man he saw vanished as if he never existed. Mrs. Karnar screamed, telling him his wife was alone. Neighbors gathered, and the police were called, arresting John for murder. With no evidence of another person present, John's mental state was examined, and he was found sane, leading to his execution. The family collapsed, especially Mrs. Karnar, who died after her son's death. Years passed, and after Julia's husband died, she decided to move back into her father's house, which was in a more upscale area than where she lived with her husband. Planning to prepare the house alone for a week before her children moved in, Julia cleaned her father's old office. Feeling extremely tired, she decided to rest on the bed and woke feeling as if someone had touched her. Terrified, she quickly left the room and told her siblings, who laughed and warned her not to enter again due to the murder that had occurred there, suggesting the room might be haunted. Julia convinced herself it was her imagination and returned to the house, intending to re-enter the room to assure herself nothing was amiss. However, she found the office door locked as if from the inside, despite her attempts with a key. Suddenly, she heard her father's voice saying she had only one chance. Overwhelmed, Julia decided to return to her old house to live with her children, leaving her father's house closed for a long time again. Days went by, and while sitting with her sister Layla, Jessica recounted the events since her return. Curiosity overtook her as she remembered her father's warning never to enter a certain room. She decided to try opening her father's room, especially since she had never attempted it before due to being preoccupied with her daughter. Surprisingly, unlike what her sister had said, the door opened easily for Jessica. Days passed, and her husband came to check on their daughter. He noticed Jessica's unusual beauty and couldn't believe how she had changed so rapidly. Before he could express his admiration, he saw his daughter running towards him, hugging him with evident sickness and emaciation. Suddenly, the daughter looked at her mother and wet herself, despite being 4 years old. Jessica's husband was shocked by his daughter's condition and felt her fear of her mother. Forgetting Jessica's unusual beauty, he took his daughter and left the house angrily. Jessica, who had thought her husband would return to her once he saw her beauty, Jessica continued in this state until her sister Julia, informed by Jessica's husband of the situation, decided to visit. As soon as she entered the house, Julia smelled the same musty odor she had smelled when she first entered her father's room as a child. Jessica confided in Julia a secret nobody else knew, begging her not to tell anyone else. Julia promised to keep the secret, but didn't believe Jessica's story. Upset, Jessica asked if Julia didn't see her beauty, but strangely, Julia didn't and thought her sister had gone mad. Trying to console her, Julia advised Jessica to take care of herself and try to mend her relationship with her husband and daughter. Unable to bear her older sister's words, Jessica threw her out of the house and returned to her room, not leaving the rituals or the mirror. Unbeknownst to her, only men could see her beauty. Jessica remained dissatisfied with her appearance until she entered a state of nervous breakdown and decided to write down her story before committing suicide. 2 weeks passed without Jessica appearing or inquiring about her daughter or sisters. Julia decided to visit, only to find Jessica hanging from a noose in the room, driven to madness by her obsession with beauty. Julia and Layla mourned their sister and previously their brother, convinced that Jessica's ex-husband was the cause of her madness. Months later, while crossing the street, Layla had an accident and was hospitalized, discovering she had partial blindness and a tremor in her hands that made her unable to hold anything heavy. Layla took leave from her job and stayed at home, but her husband couldn't cope with her condition and divorced her. Returning to her old home broken and sad, Layla visited every doctor and hospital, hoping her condition would improve, to no avail. One day, while sitting in the living room, the door to her father's office mysteriously opened, as if inviting her in. Surprised, Layla approached the room and found the window open, realizing a draft had caused the door to open. Before closing the door, she decided to inspect the mysterious room she had rarely explored. There, she found the same strange book her sister had used, now with 3 different bloodstains varying in darkness. As she flipped through the book, Layla found a broken mirror and immediately understood she could use it to read the reversed words. Jessica struggled to read the first chapter of the book due to her shaky hands. Each title in the book represented something significant that every person aspires to, such as wealth, beauty, offspring, and health. She understood the significant transformation her family underwent from poverty to becoming among the wealthiest, as she had been told. She learned that her father chose wealth, but the condition was that he wouldn't enjoy it because he would die young, and he was the one who made the first bloodstain in the book. The second stain belonged to her brother's wife, who wished for offspring but had to betray her husband with a demon, resulting in her death. The third stain was for her sister, who desired beauty with the condition that no one would enjoy her endless beauty. After reading, Jessica decided to reread the chapter on health, the dream she hoped to achieve, especially since she was young and wished to live her life happily. However, the condition for obtaining health was loss. Layla didn't understand the meaning of loss, but she felt she had nothing more important to lose than her health, so she chose the same path as those before her. After performing the rituals for the first time, Layla began to see improvements in her eyes and hands and continued until she was fully healed. Finally, enjoying her life, visiting relatives, and even receiving a marriage proposal, Layla achieved her dream. She insisted on getting married in her parents' house, where she lived happily and decided to have children immediately. However, months after giving birth, her only child became paralyzed, and her husband fell seriously ill. Layla devoted her energy and health to caring for them until she decided to open the book again, looking for a cure. She reached the last chapter about reverse rituals, written in normal text, not reversed. Shocked after understanding that the condition for health meant losing her loved ones, Layla faced a difficult choice between her family and herself. She chose her family and lost her health. After completing the rituals, she began feeling a slight tremor in her hands and blurred vision, but found her husband and son's condition improving. As Layla's condition worsened day by day, she remembered the time she was fully healthy and happy. After a medical consultation, she discovered her eyesight would never improve and would continue to deteriorate until she became blind. Layla collapsed and returned home, pondering how to regain her health. She decided to perform the same rituals to restore her health and then treat her son and husband in the best hospitals worldwide. Indeed, Layla resumed the rituals, and her health began to return day by day while her husband and son became ill and their health deteriorated. Finally, Layla regained her health and decided to go out to find the best places to treat her husband and son. She decided to travel after selling her properties left by her father, along with her inheritance from her deceased siblings. 2 days later, Layla hurried back home to share the good news with her husband and son. But as soon as she entered, she found an eerie silence in the house. She rushed to her room to find her husband lying dead on the floor. She then searched for her son and found the house flooded with water. Rushing into the bathroom, she found her paralyzed son drowned in the bathtub. Layla collapsed, unable to believe what had happened, and buried the most precious thing she had in life with her own hands. She then entered a state of guilt, tormenting herself for choosing her health, which proved to be of no benefit. She wrote down her story alongside her sisters and decided to end her life in the same way. Julia was the only remaining sister from the Carners, deciding to burn the book, close the house, and insist that no one ever enter it again. And so, the story ends.